Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Quest for Truth. We've been in a series called Prophecy, and we've been looking at the prophecy as it relates to Jesus, the Messiah, and especially what the Old Testament has to say about. Last week we looked at his life, and this week we're going to be looking at what the Old Testament has to say about his death. And so we're going to be looking at just two different passages this week, even though there's a few others we could go to, but there's a lot really in these two passages. So we're going to start in Psalm 22, and we're going to go 1 through 24. My God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning. O my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. Yet you are holy. O you are enthroned above the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out, and were delivered. In you they trusted, and were not disappointed. But I am a worm, and not a man, a reproach of men, and despised by the people. All who see me sneer at me. They separate with the lip. They wag the head, saying, Commit yourself to the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, because he delights in him. Yet you are he who brought me forth from the womb. You made me trust when upon my mother's breast. Upon you I was cast from birth. You have been my God from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Many bulls have surrounded me, strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouths at me. As a ravening and a roaring lion, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melting within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death. For dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierce my hands and my feet, I can count all my bones. They stared at me. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, be not far off. O you my help, hasten to my assistance, deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen, you answer me. I will tell of your name to my brethren in the midst of the assembly. I will praise you, you who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him. In all you descendants of Israel, for he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him, but when he cried to him for help, he heard. So there's a lot of different details here that we can see that happened in the death of the Messiah, of what this is prophesying about it. And it starts off in verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the words of Jesus. He repeats those words as he's on the cross, when God turns his face away from him. And in verse 6, it talks about that he would be despised by the people, that he would be despised by the people that he came for, that he should have been one of, but he wasn't, because they treated him as an outsider. And so they then in verse 11, right, we see that idea again. Be not far from me, for trouble is near, for there is none to help. Again, that idea when Jesus was on the cross, of asking God why he forsook him and why he was so far away in the time of trouble. And in verse 16, we begin to see the idea of how he was killed, not in detail, but complete detail, but some detail here. And it says, they pierced my hands and my feet. And we know that Jesus was crucified. He was hung on a tree with nails through his hands and through his feet. And in verse 17, it continues to say that I can count all my bones. Again, how poorly he was treated, and he could count them, but I think that may relate, and I'm not entirely sure, but that possibly relates to the fact that none of his bones were broken, so that he could count all of them as the way that they were, not being broken. And verse 18 kind of continues that train there. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. This again at the foot of the cross, the Roman soldiers who were crucifying him took his clothes and were, instead of ripping them apart and sharing them that way, they cast lots so that whoever won the casting of the lots would take the complete garment, just as was prophesied here in Psalm 22. And then in 24, it talks about how he didn't despise the affliction. Jesus went to the cross willingly. When he was on the cross, they said, if you're the King of the Jews, save yourself. And he could have easily done that, but he chose not to, because he didn't hate what he was doing, because he loved the people that he was doing it for. And we're going to see a little bit more of that in Isaiah. Kind of gets to a little bit more behind it, but we also see some more detail here of the prophetic of what was to happen. So Isaiah 53, I'm going to read it and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty, that he should look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And like one from whom men hid their face, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our grief he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The chastising for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. All of us like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned to his own way, but the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that is silent before its shearers, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people, to whom the stroke was due. Yet his grave was assigned with wicked men, yet he was with a rich man in his death, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. But the Lord was pleased to crush him, putting him to grief, if he would render himself as a guilt offering. He will see his offspring, he will prolong his days, and the good pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. As a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. By his knowledge, the righteous one, my servant, will justify the many, as he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he will divide the booty with the strong. Because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he himself bore the sins of many, and interceded for the transgressors. Now, before we get to the kind of the main driving force behind this prophecy, I'm going to point out a few kind of more of the subtle things here. So verse 7 talks about, again, him being silent before his accusers, just as Jesus was silent before his accusers. And verses 8 and 9 bring up something interesting. Or verse 9, just verse 9. His grave was assigned with wicked men. He was, Jesus was killed on a cross, and that cross would have only been used to kill people who were very wicked. Roman citizens couldn't be hung on a cross because of how bad it was. And so it was, and he was, there with a thief on his left and his right, people who were very wicked, and he was killed with them, and their bodies would have just been thrown to the dogs. Yet we know that there was a rich man who came and took his body and put him in his own grave, the grave of that rich man that's prophesied here. But kind of to the point of this whole chapter here is that this death of Jesus wouldn't be a common death. There's something more to it, because Jesus wouldn't die for his own sins, but for the sins of others. Isaiah is prophesying that Jesus would bear the iniquity of the people by being their guilt offering. Especially when you look at 10 through 12, but even, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities, the chastisement for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. In verse 10, if he would render himself as a guilt offering, he will see his offering, he will prolong his days. And as a result, he would bear their iniquities. He himself bore the sin of many and interceded for the transgressors. And so here in Isaiah we see that him prophesy that the death of Jesus wouldn't just be the death of any man, but it would be the death that would bring about the salvation of many, the rescue of many from sin. This idea that started back in Genesis 3:15, it talked about the seed that would crush the serpent's head, though it would bring him peril. Here we see brought forward more and fleshed out as this Messiah would die, would go to the cross, and yet through that he would bring about the salvation of many, the forgiveness of sins, because he took our place on, and he took our punishment for the sins that we've committed upon himself, and he paid for them in full. And the death of the only sinless man to walk the earth brings us life. If we believe in him, we will be cleansed of all sin, as Jesus paid for it all in full in his death. But he didn't stay dead, and that's where we're going to pick up next week. I'll see you then.